Hi, Cynthia.
Hi.
Right, so we are doing World War II. I mean, if you want, we could also do the Cold War. It's
Okay.
up to you, because I think it runs up close to the time of our next week's meeting.
Mm-hmm.
So it's up to you, hon.
Yeah, that's
Um,
fine.
all right, so you doing okay?
Yeah, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Yeah,
Awesome.
just kind of same old, same old. No news is good news though, right?
Yes.
All right, so let's see here. Come on. By completing your profile setup. No, I don't want to do that right now. Let's see here. World War II should be up here. Let's see here. Sorry. Let's see if it'll let me open it. I just had a meeting with another the same course as yours, and we
Mm.
did the same thing. And so that's what's strange about not seeing the World War II because we did it. We went over it. But maybe I closed it out and don't remember. Let's see here. So I'll go back to it. Let's see. Test four material, Latinos in World War II. All right. So can you see that okay, Cynthia? Did that pop up for you?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. Well, to me it's an interesting subject. I try to, think of a argumentative a source of dialogue to get into each topic. And with this one, right, I was really interested when I went to a Catholic college, the just war doctrine. Um, and it was, it created criteria under which you as a Catholic can go to war, fight, kill, die, and it won't be held against you as sin, okay, under certain circumstances, under the blessing of the church. And so, at any rate, it was just under two broad categories, as you would imagine, the reasons for which you fight and the manner by which you fight. Okay. So, the reasons for which you fight, they pretty much fall under the, you know, uh, self-protection and chivalry. And chivalry, right? Like you're protecting someone who can't protect himself, right? Like I think of like Don Quixote, right? He goes on these night errands.
Yeah.
He's trying to defend those who can't defend themselves, right? He's
Yeah.
going to be the chivalric knight to protect them. And so the Catholic Church likewise. You had Augustine of Hippo began writing on this topic, and then several theologians after him added to it. And so today it's kind of codified and put together, synthesized by a guy from the 1600s. His name was Hugo Grotius, Grotius. And he kind of like summed it up really well and put it together. And so he's kind of I've looked just as much, if not more, at Hugo Grotius as I have at the Catholic Church for this type of doctrine. But at any rate, yeah, that's how it goes. One thing that seems to be a little bit, interestingly uh, questioned by some of my students who have served time in combat, especially some of my veteran students, is the idea of proportionality. When someone strikes a village and kills a handful of people, you don't drop an atomic bomb on their capital city and kill 200,000, right? And so their sense of proportionality, some people have a hard time with. They don't think it's very realistic, but it's still very interesting. And it does seem to go along with the idea that is consistent with the Catholic Church, is that you only do what's necessary. You just do whatever is necessary and nothing beyond that. Okay. And so when you look at World War II and you look at the reasons for which we fought, when we go to number one, court history has some data behind it, um, as far as us being the good guys. So with fascism, right? It's bad enough that these countries are turning fascist because the idea of fascism, the ideology of fascism is kind of um, inimical. It's harmful to what a lot that which we hold dear, from the French Enlightenment and so forth. So, for instance, right, um, with fascism, and you might know all this already. It's organic. So it looks at society like a human body, and so you and I and anyone else for that matter are just a part of that body. You're a toe, metaphorically, you're a leg, you're a hand, etc. And so your significance is derived as a cog in the wheel only insofar as what you contribute to the whole. And as far as your happiness, your sense and desire for fulfillment, um, that those are all pretty much not only irrelevant, but they're almost considered dangerous with fascism, right? Because like the hand can't go his own way, right? He's got to do what the rest of the body's doing and work with the rest of the body. He can't just do his own thing, metaphorically. And so with fascism, we as individuals don't mean anything. That as far as the value of the individual human's life, much less that person's autonomy to do what he or she wants. We're accustomed to classical liberalism, especially, right? That when I mentioned before that your freedom to swing your fist ends only where my nose begins. You do whatever you want until it harms somebody else. But that's not the case with fascism. You are to be, I think of Rousseau when he said that the individuals are, and that's not a part of Rousseau that you hear too often. You hear about the social contract and like the good parts. But Rousseau also said that people will force to go with the general will, right? His general will term was a little bit scary. There's no room for dissent, for disagreement, for protest. That is stifled immediately. You have to go with the general will. And then secondly, with the general will, right? Who decides the general will? Well, they give just almost unlimited power to one individual leader, right? Their dictator, to almost mystically decide what the general will is, what's best and what's destined for the nation at large. And so, they just kind of generically called him the leader in their own languages, the Führer and the Duce in Germany and Italy. And but boy, did they have a lot of power. I don't know if I'd go so far as say unlimited, because they had coups against them. They had other people that they relied upon to carry out their orders and so forth. But boy, did they have a lot of power, nevertheless, as far as being the ultimate arbiters or deciders of the nation's destiny, including how they fought out on the field. So, with the the idea of everyone being together and forced to go into the general will and told what the general will is by one individual, that's leading to an autocratic and an oppressive government. Of course, you had the Gestapo and the military police watching what you were doing and holding you accountable for the conformity that was expected of you. All right. And of course, there's no concern about representative government with elections and so forth. Hitler had the Reichstag burnt to the ground and blamed the left wing for it. And the Reichstag, the parliament, its days were done. And he declared the Enabling Act, where he's supposed to be the dictator for only 6 months, and 6 months turned into a lot longer than that, right? And then with Japan, they had a diet, they had a parliament, but in 1936, they had like in February or March of 36, they had a series of political assassinations brought forth by their military, by the radical wing of their military that was for um, taking over other countries for colonization in East Asia and in the Pacific. So at any rate, when they did that, prime ministers even, and even more so, just the regular parliamentary representatives were scared to death of the military, and they kind of kowtowed to the military. And then, of course, they made Prince Onoye step down as the chancellor or prime minister, and they put in Tojo, the military leader, as their prime minister, mixing military and civilian rule. And then, of course, you could arguably say that the emperor was a bit of a puppet to Tojo and the military segment that kind of ran the show in Japan. And so, at any rate, and then, of course, Mussolini had his black shirts that would rough up all the opposition. They banned any other political party. It's scary stuff. And then, of course, they were for institutionalized violence. They were for violence against their domestic foes, and they were for violence in having creating an empire at the expense of neighbors and the neighboring nations. And so the euphemism that was used by the Germans, right, was Lebensraum or living space. They contended that they're going to create a third Reich, a third empire, and it needed living space for the chosen people. And then with Japan, it was the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was their term translated to English. And they were absolutely for taking other countries over and imposing a fascist government over them. So it's not bad enough that that you have fascism in these countries. Now they're imposing it by force on all their neighbors. All right. And so and then of course you have the Holocaust, whereby they had a very narrow definition in Germany. You had to have been through the grandparents uh, of pure quote German ancestry. If you had even 1/8 of Jewish, Slavic, uh, some other type of blood, you were likely not to be considered a part of the people's community, the Volksgemeinschaft, as they called it. And with the people's community, right, there were lots of people who didn't meet it. It was not just a matter of ethnicity, but sometimes it was a matter of behavior and political persuasion. They did not allow communists and socialists. They did not allow homosexuals. They did not allow the homeless. They did not allow Albanian gypsies, like I said, Slavic people. They're all termed to be undesirables. And then, of course, Catholic and Protestant Christian. Uh, he made he made a deal with the Catholic Church for now. He made a deal with what was called the Confessing Church of Protestant denominations. But that didn't last throughout the whole war. And at some point, especially at concentration camps like Dachau, uh, he had Catholic priests and Protestant clergymen killed and put into Dachau. So at any rate, scary stuff. And then of course you had the cleanup crew, the Einsatzgruppen, and when they decided that a nation they were invading was filled with people of an undesirable demographic, their final solution, right, in the famous meeting of the SS, their final solution was to kill them, to have them killed. So the Einsatzgruppe, they didn't even bother sending them on trains to the concentration camps. They killed them with guns on the spot. So at any rate, I'm saying here, right, is that this was a worthwhile war. We're and matter of fact, if you wanted to look into Cynthia, the Atlantic Charter, uh, it stipulates why the Allies were the good guys and what they were fighting for. that was basic to Western civilization.
Mm.
All right. Then number two, I just deflect and I say the manner by which the Japanese fought the war was rather uh, unjust, according to Catholic doctrine. Um, for one, I mainly mention the treatment of prisoners of war, of POWs. As you see there, that rate is incredibly high. Nearly 40% of U.S. prisoners of war under the Japanese did not live through the war. That's incredibly high. You had the Bataan Death March. You had the Marus Maru episode when they were trying to swim up to the Japanese ships because they were drowning, and they were hacking them to pieces with axes. Um, and this mutatis mutandis, as circumstances dictate, the Japanese believed, right, under the code of Bushido, the samurai code, that you forfeited your right to your life and virtually entitlement to anything when you cowardly surrender before death. And so they didn't feel like they owed anything to their prisoners of war. They refused to deal with the Red Cross. In some cases, they it was just awful. In some cases, they would paint the Red Cross on their ships to not be attacked, and then and then of course attack when the moment was right, when they would sneak up upon an Allied ship, etc. In some cases, they refused to when the Red Cross was trying to treat people, they would kill them, and so they were quite brutal with prisoners of war. And they did the old Roman decimation process too, right? Where you just count to 10 and kill one out of every 10, just to scare and frighten into submission the ones that are left. So you have all that happened during the war. Um, and things just got brutal. You have some of the smaller islands uh, whereby the Americans retaliated. It went both ways. Like so, for instance, you had Peleliu, Peleleiu, and then also Tarawa, Tarawa. But one of these, right? It was only like 2.5 miles wide, like 14 miles long, and they somehow crammed like almost 40,000 Japanese soldiers on this little island. And they ended up taking fewer than 10 prisoners of war. They had to kill all of them. They fought to the death. And of course, their use of the Kaiten and the what was the name of the other one? There was the Kaiten bomb, and there was one other one, Ayuk bomb. At any rate, they were uh, they were missiles that were directed and ridden by a Japanese pilot, and he would commit suicide, killing himself and try to take out as many Americans. Aoka bomb, I think it was called, uh, in the process. And so the manner by which Japan fought, we had a real bad problem with it. Um, and by the way, also in the Philippines, they took sometimes prepubescent girls, and the euphemism they used for it was comfort women, and they would rape them, and so there's a lot of primary source evidence for atrocities in the Philippines for some reason, uh, for quite from quite a few sources. Right. And then also they would take our POWs and they would force them to do slave labor, which was against international law as well. They had them build the Great Burma Railroad, and Burma Road. They the businesses that were under contract with the Japanese government to provide some type of military commodity. They were called zaibatsu. They were given contracts to use American and Allied prisoners of war as their laborers, and they were free to do what they liked because they always had military on the premises. They always had Japanese soldiers, and they were free to do quite a bit of damage, whip and beat, and in some severe cases, actually shoot and kill the prisoners of war, even in these factories. And then, of course, the rape of Nanking um, in China. If you look that up, that just speaks for itself. I don't know if I even want to talk much about that one, but it was awful. All right. So remember, ostensibly on paper, the Japanese were supposed to be saving other Asians from Western European colonialism. But when they took them over, they did not treat them as equals, co-prosperity sphere. No, they did not. They absolutely were quite exploitative and even ruthless with the other Asian countries that they took over. The with Dutch Borneo, they had a lot of oil there. Although the Dutch were rather successful in burning and destroying much of the big sources of oil before the Japanese came in. But when they came in there, they were quite ruthless with the people, the civilian population there. Also, when they took over Singapore, they were quite ruthless with the East Indian and English and other Malaysian and so forth population in Singapore. In Singapore, what's interesting, right, is they took over with a quote bicycle army to get into the forest and so forth. They used thousands and thousands of bicycles, and they were outnumbered 3-1 by the British, and they got the British to surrender. So at any rate, moving on to number three, three and four, I do a 180, and I do revisionist history that's more critical of the U.S. So I talk about, right, the manner by which we fought was not always so upstanding by just war standards. So one of the pivotal components to how you fight in just war doctrine pertains to the treatment of non-combatants, right? The idea of a combatant uh, issuing, some type of physical violence upon a non-combatant as almost absurd in this doctrine as like, you and I going to a football game and sitting in the stands and the football players with their gear on run up the steps and tackle us in the um, in the crowd. And so that's supposed to just not happen. But of course it did. And we were guilty of it as well. Now, in our defense, somewhat, um, the Germans bombed the heck out of London and Bristol and Liverpool in England, and so our ally Winston Churchill had no problem with returning the favor. But we continued that we at least wanted to follow some type of policy to limit the damage to non-combatants. So what we did is we devised a point system, and there each city, as far to become a bona fide target, it had to merit a certain number of points. All right. Usually the point system was just up to 5 points. So like 5 points, for instance, might be, um, you know, uh, military material, guns, ammunition, bombs, tanks, etc. Right? If a city has factories that are producing that, that's worth 5 points right away. And then maybe where 3 points are like telecommunications, right? That could be used by the military quite handily. And so a city was supposed to merit a certain number of points, which in this case I think would have been more than five. You had to have had at least two factors um, to merit it becoming a military target. But even so, right? In that case, we had um, more than one on that criteria list in the East Bay, in Berkeley, Richmond, Oakland, creating war material and other things to help the war effort. Uh, could you imagine if they bombed that? Not just the factories and killing innocent civilians who were just trying to get a job that paid well in these munition factories, but then also, right, people in Oakland and Richmond itself, their houses, apartments, restaurants, movie theaters, getting attacked. And that's what we did. We did that to Germany and we did that to Japan. And in fact, with Japan, we even used incendiary bombs that deliberately were used to light fires in the cities. And supposedly the case with Dresden, Dresden, in Germany was supposedly a mistake. It wasn't intended, but it happened nevertheless, whether it was an accident or not. They were dropping bombs at night, and it was very windy and a lot with a light rain, and they couldn't see their targets, so they dropped flares, and the flares caught fire. And so it caused great destruction in Dresden and killed, uh, if I remember correctly, over 10,000 civilians, Germans. All right. And so, we sometimes we're not above doing that. Um, Sorry about that with the dogs. Uh, then at other times, we had to our leaders made decisions that affected American servicemen's lives. So, for instance, at Schweinfurt, Germany, uh, our leaders used bombers as bait, basically, to get the German Luftwaffe to come up into the sky at a certain altitude. So then and only then our P-51 Mustangs could utilize their technological um, superiority and take them out. So it was great for the Mustangs and the Mustang pilots and for the country, but if the bombers, they were sacrificed, and at times that phenomenon happened for choosing a quote greater good, but that affected people's lives. Um, Operation Magic was cracking the military code of Japan. Okay. Remember we got the Enigma machine and the Ultra program to translate the codes of the German Nazis from England and Bletchley Park. And then, if my memory serves me correctly, we may have devised ourselves the cracking of the code for Japan, known as Operation Magic. And so, when the Japanese were beginning to see that we were onto them, and that perhaps we had cracked their code, we stepped back and we stopped warning our boys when an attack was coming because we wanted to feign ignorance and make the Japanese think, no, 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 they must not have our code cracked and kind of allay their fears so that they wouldn't change their code again. And we'd have to start all over cracking the code. But in refusing to warn our boys, that cost lives, right? That cost lives. And then, like I said, we got to the point where we became convinced of the what's the word, the adjective I'm thinking of, not maniacal, fanatical, the alleged fanatical nature of the Japanese uh, temperament and manner of defending these islands that we stopped, trying very, very earnestly to even take prisoners of war. And one of the islands, right, the Japanese had killed an American, and they put a body part of his in another place to mutilate him. And the Americans, we have this in a primary source. The Americans, furious over it, captured the first Japanese they could and started cutting his teeth out of his mouth. And so things got nasty between the Americans and the Japanese in the Pacific, fighting on these islands. They did not always just simply take prisoners of war and treat them soundly and all that. It wasn't just the Japanese. So anyway, we didn't always fight, uh, you know, chivalrically. Then number four, uh, the manner, or I'm sorry, the reason for which we fought wasn't always what we claimed it to be in the Atlantic Charter. So, for instance, one of the heart and soul of the Atlantic Charter, you might subjectively argue, was our claim of holding on to the dignity of the individual, right? And the humanity, the dignity, and the natural rights of the individual everywhere around the globe. Well, we talked about that, right, with our rhetoric, but how did we treat our people of color during the war? Not well, all right? So you see here with the Mexican Americans, they saw themselves excluded from the enjoyment of the same rights and aspirations that many of their neighbors took for granted. They were put in separate school systems. Um, let's see here. Their education was vocationally oriented. They were seen as with special needs if they didn't know English fluently. All right. There was no effort to push them into college. If you choose that video on the Chicano movement, you'll see that. Adding to these inequities, land developers and real estate agents engaged in deliberate policies to encourage white habitation of suburbs and brown habitation of inner cities, which combined with the tendency to carry out chain migration following loved ones among Latinos, ended in housing segregation. All right. Latinos were poorly represented politically. Remember, we mentioned gerrymandering and taking the districts that were kind of homogeneously Mexican American and splitting them up with many other Anglo districts to literally force them to become the numerical minority in all the voting districts so that they couldn't have a majority in certain voting districts and elect, Latinos into office. So yeah, that absolutely happened and it's still happening. Excuse me. And then look at this with Latino income. Not even half of that of the white Americans. So according to my source here, right, Mexican Americans were making about 968 a year, and their Anglo counterparts were making 2,047 a year, more than twice as much. All right. Nevertheless, according to the Chicano historians, Mexican Americans tried to prove their worth out on the field. So Guy Gabaldon, he took almost 1,000 prisoners of war at Saipan through his use of the Japanese language. Macario Garcia, he was known as the Daring Mexican, storming machine gun nests while wounded. All right. Some even received medals of honor. Okay. You see here, Angel Romero stormed Normandy. You have um, Cabo Rodriguez endured the death march, the Bataan Death March in the Philippines. Okay. Let's see here. And then at this time, you have the Zoot Suit riots. And with the Zoot Suit riots, you had a fist fight between a young Mexican American. At this time, Mexican Americans in the urban enclaves of Mexican American, inhabitants, for whatever reason, were termed pachucos at this time. And so, if you were a young Mexican American living in East LA, and especially if you bought into the fad of wearing a zoot suit and wearing your hair longer on top and slicked back, long and curly and slicked back, you were termed, identified by outsiders as a Pachuco. And so these two identified Pachucos were whistling and catcalling at an Anglo girl with her boyfriend, and he got in a fist fight with one of them, and the young Mexican American broke his jaw. And so he came back to the ship. The others saw that his jaw had been broken, and they found out that it had been broken by a Pachuco, and they wanted revenge. So they came back in large numbers into East LA looking for fights, and things just got out of hand. And when the Anglos were able to prevail over Pachucos, they'd strip them of their clothes and they would burn their zoot suit in the middle of the street as like a symbol. And so a lot of animosity. And then while right about at the same time of the Zoot Suit riots, you had the Sleepy Lagoon case. Jose Diaz was murdered at a party, and a guy named who went by the name of Hank Levas and his buddies were present there. They'd had a verbal altercation with him earlier, and that's about all the information they had. It was just circumstantial at best. But because of the racism of the judge and his preconceptions and prejudices and the way that they looked, they were convicted of Jose Diaz's murder. And they served, I don't know how many years, but literally years in prison until one of the girlfriends came forward with conclusive evidence that her brother, not a part of that group, had been guilty of killing Jose Diaz. And only after he himself had been murdered by someone else did she feel free to come forward with that information. And so they had served time for nothing. They were innocent. And so that kind of stuff's going on during World War II. And then you had the Rapido River incident. And at the Rapido River, you had Mexican Americans who were told to cross this river. And evidently, under the circumstances, with the machine gun nests that were aimed at them, that it was a fruitless, suicidal pursuit. But they had to do it anyway. And one of them finally refused and told the others, "You're not going either." And he was court-martialed. And thankfully, the military establishment actually defended the young Hispanic man, and they found plenty of evidence that it was uh, kind of racistly uh, motivated, and that it was a suicidal mission that they were deliberately sent on, and they weren't to be punished for refusing the order. They were from San Antonio, Texas, almost all the soldiers. And Felix Lagoria, he was in Texas as well. He was killed in the Philippines. And the local people at the military cemetery refused to have him buried there because he was Mexican American. And then, of course, the Japanese. When they had the trials and the court martials of Walter Short and husband Kimmel for negligence at Pearl Harbor, um, they went through the evidence and they did find evidence of Japanese attaches, um, as well as private citizen Japanese who were there as ostensibly as tourists planning the attack. And so the Japanese developed a reputation, there was a prejudice that developed against them that they were sneaky, that they couldn't be trusted. And so when the war carried on, there were balloon bombs that were set off in about five different places that traveled all the way across the Pacific and exploded in West Coast states. But they were very minor in incident. Like I said, there were only about four or five of them that made it and exploded. But they killed a handful of people, especially in Oregon. And then you also had a case with a gentleman who was caught, a Japanese soldier, and he had papers in his knapsack that had a map of the American West Coast and showed routes that they would take to make it all the way through the Rockies from the west. And then in addition to that, the Aleutian Islands, right off of Alaska, the Japanese put 30,000 soldiers on those islands as kind of a feint attack uh, that caused hysteria of a West Coast invasion. So there was no trust in the Japanese immigrants, nor even in the Japanese Americans in their loyalty. And so they were forced to go into internment camps by the military, about 2 dozen of them. And there were several of them here in California, one being right down in Merced. But at any rate, they were to, like in Seattle, they were told, bring everything that you can carry, and that's it. And a lot of them, right, they were gone in the internment camps, unable to pay their property taxes, and they had their property confiscated from them, as if they were in a position to be able to pay their property taxes. And so they were given a questionnaire about their loyalty, and those who gave the wrong answers, and a lot of them were young men who were angry, who gave the quote wrong answers, were put into Tulare. That's where they called the troublemakers. They had a couple riots, and the second riot there were shooting by the guards of real bullets, and they killed a few of them. So a few of them were killed in these camps in Tulare. You had a handful of elderly people that died in the camps as well. And had they had quicker access to a hospital, they probably would not have. So at any rate, there's a young man named Fred Korematsu from Fresno, and his case went to the Supreme Court. And he said, by virtue of the 14th Amendment, he was born here in California. He'd never even been to Japan, and they had no right to intern him and other Japanese Americans who were born here. And the Supreme Court ruled against them and said that under civilian rule, that would be the case. But because it's a time of war, this was a war emergency clause, and that was a special time, and therefore the military had a right to do it, including American citizen Japanese of Japanese ancestry. So at any rate, a good book, by the way, is Strangers from a Different Shore on Asian Americans, where you have this in there. Let's see here. And despite their treatment, some volunteered to fight, and under the 442nd Regiment, and they are, well, I believe, the most highly decorated regiment in American military history, and they were Japanese Americans. But most of them had to fight in Italy against the Nazis because they were not trusted to fight against the Japanese. You see the Zoot Suit riots. You see the Pachucos, Hank Levas and his friends who were wrongfully convicted of Jose Diaz's murder. And then Rosie the Riveter, working as riveters of airplane wings. Most of them in the East Bay were black women. And there's a book called Abiding Courage. It's a really good book on that. And it shows all the discrimination that they faced while trying to serve the country and serve the military at their jobs. Okay. So what I say very cynically at the end is that the US was a lesser evil at best. So a lot more cynical than the first two sections. All right. So if you don't mind, I'm gonna I'm gonna end it here today, okay, Cynthia?
Okay.
Um, but yeah, this is World War II, and this one's due, I think, this coming up week. And yeah, if you don't mind, I'll do the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement next week, if you don't mind.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay?
Yes.
All right, so I hope you're doing well, and that's kind of it for today.
Alrighty, yes. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
The Pachucos really got my attention. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
Yeah, no wonder that. So that's how it all started, huh?
Uh-huh. Yeah,
Yeah.
it is. It's very interesting. They have great documentaries on it,
Hmm.
and it's a fascinating subject. It really is. Yeah.
Alrighty. Thank you.
All right, you're welcome, hon. All right, so have a good day, have a good week,
Thank
and
you.
I hope to see you next week, okay?
Yeah. I'll see you next week. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
All right, bye-bye.